Welcome all. Appreciate you coming out on this beautiful day, or maybe it's more appropriate to say appreciate you coming in on such a beautiful day. We've been enjoying nice Palo Alto weather the last few days that we've been here, those of us who are guests at least. I'm Terry Anderson. I'm a senior fellow of the John and Jean Denault Senior Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. I've been coming to Hoover for now 23 years. But I only come for 3 months out of every year. My wife, Monica, and I live in Montana, and most people, when we say we come for 3 months, they're sure that it must be January, February, March. But that's only people who haven't had to live in Montana for March, April, and May, the other 3 months of winter. So we're fortunate to come down where there actually is springtime, when every flower in Palo Alto is blooming. I came here largely because of the work that I do in the area of environmental economics and environmental policy, and I still have a keen passion for all of that. But my fires are really burning much more because of coming into contact with some of the people you'll hear from in a few minutes, and working on a project called Renewing Indigenous Economies. I was just telling Bill a second ago, we had a research workshop preceding the program that Jim is here for last week, and at the end we gathered in the courtyard over at Schwab one evening for some wine, and there was a group from the Alumni Association there. And they said, well, where are you from? And I said, oh, I'm at the Hoover Institution. They said, what are you here for? And I figured they were thinking it would be something on military issues or monetary issues. And I said, well, we're here at a conference on renewing indigenous economies. And this person who asked me was like, people at Hoover are interested in indigenous economies? He was just flabbergasted that there would be any such topic undertaken here at Hoover. I'm glad we have undertaken it, and am pleased to have brought together for the last few days a group of tribal and First Nation leaders from New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. We've had some productive academic discussions with more regressions than anybody would want to have to sit through. And today, a much more stimulating roundtable discussion involving Indigenous leaders and talking about what it would take to really renew Indigenous economies. As part of this effort, I've been inspired by, where's Manny? Manny Jules, a bit back there, a band leader from Canada, who, when we first came together, told me that he was really interested in some of this work that had been done by some guy named Jim Robinson. And I had the great privilege of saying, yes, I know Jim. Jim came together as part of a property rights task force that we have here at Hoover, and we got to meet many, many times as a part of that task force. I invited Jim, and he was excited when I told him about the project, and he said he was willing to come. I don't think I've ever looked at Jim's vita or delved into his pedigree, but when I got his bio and it said drawing insights from game theory, I was like, oh, what have I done? But I assure you that you don't have to worry any more than I do. Jim goes far beyond whatever insights he's drawn from game theory. I first met Jim when he was still at that school over, I can't remember the name of it, someplace out there on the East Coast that professes to be as good as Stanford. But now is the Institute Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflicts at the University of Chicago. Jim, when I invited him, said, well, I don't know a lot about Native American issues, indigenous issues. And I said, oh, I think you know a lot about what you wrote about in a book with Duran Asiomoglu, Why Nations Fail. And it seemed to me that many of the insights there help us understand what it takes to renew indigenous economies, or to understand why those economies have not performed well. Jim, though, in his humble way, said he didn't know a lot about the indigenous economies of North America and perhaps New Zealand, but I assure you he will regale us with a lot that he knows about Latin American and sub-Saharan African economies. It is a great pleasure to have my friend Jim back in our midst, and I welcome him to the podium.
Thank you very much, Terry. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a really fascinating day, but I won't belabor that since not all of you were here. But anyway, I've been learning a lot, and what I'm going to do today is, as Terry says, I don't pretend at all to know about the challenges of indigenous society in North America and Australasia that we've been talking about today, but I do know quite a lot about the history and challenges in other indigenous society, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where I do a lot of research. And in fact, the more I read the stuff that Terry was sending me to read for my homework, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, oh gosh, this is all the same issues that every people face in Africa, dealing with the history of the past, colonialism, the legacy of colonialism, trying to assert their autonomy and create political institutions and economic institutions that generate prosperity for their people. And that's what this book is all about. Why Nations Fail, not why Indian nations fail. That's my future book with Daron to be, well, anyway, so let's see if it happens. So I'm just going to start by reminding you of the argument in Why Nations Fail, but without supposing you've all read it. And I'll do that in an African context. And as the discussion goes on, you'll see why I do that in an African context. Okay, so just to sort of emphasize, why is this interesting? Why is the whole issue of, indigenous tribal economic development, why is that interesting from the perspective of my research? Well, because indigenous peoples are extremely poor relative to the society they're sitting in. So I pulled some data from the US Census off the web page. So I'm not sure about any of these numbers, and there's people here who know the numbers much better than me. But I think the data is seems to be very uniform that American Indian people, this is from the US Census, are systematically poorer than any other kind of minority group. They're much poorer than blacks, they're much poorer than Hispanics, and you can see, according to the census data, Indians not resident on reservations are as poor as blacks and Hispanics on average, but Indians on reservations seem to be the poorest people in United States. Okay, if you look at poverty rates, the poverty rates are absolutely staggering. So the thing I looked at, they pull out the Navajo Nation, I guess because there's a lot of Navajo people, so that sort of dominates the data. But if you just look at the overall family poverty rates, compared to the US, the green is the US all races. American Indian nations, about a third of the people are living in poverty. So the economic challenges are absolutely enormous, and we can discuss whether that's even more puzzling than, I'm going to show you some data on South Africa in a minute, and in South Africa, of course, far more black people are in poverty as a percentage. It's more like 2/3 of black people in South Africa are living in poverty. But of course, you could say it's even more paradoxical in the United States, since these people are living in, the world's supposedly most prosperous developed country. So why is it that they don't benefit from that? Okay, so that's the puzzle. How to explain this enormous incidence of poverty and underdevelopment amongst American Indian nations. Okay, and what would be the argument in Why Nations Fail? Well, there's two layers to the argument. One is an economic argument. It's a very familiar argument to economists, I think, which is that prosperity comes from things that we all know. Since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s, economists have known what creates prosperity. It's innovation, it's technology, it's investment, it's entrepreneurship. We've known it for much longer than Robert Solow, but Robert just produced a very kind of convincing empirical strategy for measuring this. So we know what it takes for a country to be economically developed, and we know in some sense that all those good things, innovation, entrepreneurship, investment, that happens in a particular institutional context. Okay? It happens when economic institutions provide broad-based incentives and opportunities in society. So we call those inclusive economic institutions. Okay? And we have this simple dichotomy, inclusive economic institutions and the opposite, which we call extractive economic institutions. So what are extractive economic institutions? They're economic institutions that do not provide broad-based economic incentives and opportunities in society. So that language is supposed to sort of cut through, the lots of details. So if you start looking at the details of economic institutions in any society, there's an enormous number of specific differences, different histories, different cultures, different details. So this language is meant to say, yeah, the economic institutions in Uzbekistan and Sierra Leone and Guatemala, they all look immensely different in lots of details, but they all have this property. They all have this property of being extractive. Okay, that's why we have that language. But the economics of it is not the really interesting part of the book, even though we spend a lot of time talking about that. I think the interesting part of the book, and what's much more the contribution of the book, is to say, okay, so let's say, that indigenous reservations in the United States or Canada are poorer than the rest of the country because they don't have inclusive economic institutions. Where did that come from? Where did those institutions come from? What explains the variation? Why does Sierra Leone have much more extractive economic institutions than Denmark does? Okay? And our view is that's about politics. Economic institutions are politically constructed by people who have the power to do it. Okay? So let me give you an example of that I'm going to illustrate it by South Africa. Okay? So here's a map of South Africa. This is the old South Africa before 1994. And these regions here are what used to be called the Bantustans. Okay? So here's the Transkei, here's Zululand, here's Botswana, down here is the Ciskei, up the Vende land. So these Bantustans, what were they? They were created in South Africa by something called the Native Land Act in 1913. So in 1913, the government of the Union of South Africa said, you blacks, that's 67% of the population according to the census, you get to live in these are your tribal lands, your ancestral lands, these Bantustans. That's 7% of the country. 67% of the people, 7% of the country. At that moment, the Native Land Act basically made it illegal for any black person to own property, to own a business in the white areas, 93% of the country. Okay? In fact, they were migrants in 93% of the country. They had to have a passbook because they lived in the Bantustans, their ancestral homelands. Okay? So this was an enormous kind of land grab which said 93% of the country is for the whites, 7% is for the blacks. Okay? So this went along with all sorts of other economic institutions. Let me give you the most egregious one. The most egregious one was something called the colour bar. The colour bar started in the mining economy in the 1890s, and by the 1920s it had spread to the whole South African white economy. Okay, what was the colour bar? Well, it gives you a flavour of the colour bar. This is from 1904. This is from a famous book by Sheila van der Horst. This is from the mining industry in Johannesburg. These are all occupations that only white people could have. Okay, if you were a plumber, you had to be white. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you had to be white. If you wanted to be an iron molder, you had to be white. What could black people do? Black people couldn't do any skilled or professional occupation. The only thing they could do is work as unskilled people in mines or farms. Okay? So this went along with the expropriation of the land in the Native Land Act. These are sort of canonical examples of what I'm calling extractive economic institutions. Okay? These removed the opportunities and incentives from all the black people in South Africa. And why did it happen? It happened because it created an economy with first world living standards for white people and a lot of impoverished black people. Okay, so this is like, you think about what's extractive economic institutions. This is a great example of extractive economic institutions. Okay, why did this get created? Why did this system get created? It wasn't because South Africa had, Harvard economists. I think that was the name of the place you were thinking of, Harvard. It wasn't because the South Africans had some lousy economists from Harvard. This was about politics, okay? This system got set up because white people had political authority and black people were completely disempowered, and white people organized an economy which was to their benefit and to the extreme disbenefit of the indigenous people, okay? So this is not North America and South America or Australasia, but when the more and more I read of what Terry sent me, it seemed to me, you know, this is the fate of all indigenous people during the history of colonialism, okay? They had their land expropriated and they got institutions foisted upon them, okay? So you know, the basic story, what's the consequence of this? Okay, this system. Well, here's some data that Daron and I used in a different paper attacking Thomas Piketty, but I'm not going to mention Thomas Piketty again in this talk. I just want to emphasize here, this is the ratio of white to black income per capita, that's this thing here. This is the ratio of white to black wages in mining. Okay, why mining? Well, because there's a fabulous, the white people didn't like collecting data on black people in South Africa. So it's sketchy getting information about black people's living standards. But one thing there was, as the historian Francis Wilson discovered, was wages of black people working in the mining companies. So this data comes from Francis Wilson's famous book about black living standards during the kind of construction of apartheid. And you can see here the ratio of white wages to black wages just kind of goes through the roof in this period. This is the kind of wake of the Native Land Act, the kind of spread of the color bar throughout society. And after 1948, a kind of much more intense social apartheid was also spread in South Africa. And let me point out, coming up also, this line falls. That means black people are starting to do relatively better than white people. It's still way out of sync, okay? So average income of white people is still about 7.5 times that of black people, but actually that gap is a lot better than it used to be before 1994, okay? And that's also significant. What happened in 1994? 1994, there was a dramatic political transition in South Africa, of course. Democracy came, black people got political rights, Nelson Mandela got elected president, but it's also a huge struggle in South Africa today as to how to reverse and change the legacy of that history of so-called apartheid, okay? So you know, and here's the figures on poverty. This is just current from the South African Statistics Bureau. You know, all this time, 25 years after the end of apartheid, 2/3 of black people are still living in poverty. So there's just enormous challenges to unwind. What are those challenges? White people still own all the assets in South Africa. They own all the land, they own all the capital. You know, there's still enormous greater investment in white people than in black people. You can see that the poverty rate of white people in South Africa is incredibly low compared to black people. Colored people, that's a kind of mixed race group of people, mostly in the Western Cape and Cape Town. Okay, so just, you know, Terry said I should remind you of the argument in our book. Our argument is about poverty and prosperity is whether or not you have extractive economic institutions, inclusive economic institutions. South Africa is obviously a case of extractive economic institutions. Why did they get created? Because of the allocation of political power in society, okay? So when we talk about inclusive political institutions is what you need to create inclusive economic institutions. We emphasize 2 dimensions. And South Africa clearly fails in one of the dimensions of inclusive political institutions, which is just broad-based political power in society. Okay? To have inclusive economic system, you can't have that at the whim of some kind of elite. That fundamentally is underpinned by participation, by accountability, by political power being broadly spread in society. So to have political inclusion, you need to have that aspect of broad-based political rights and participation. That's what you got in South Africa after 1994. But you also need effective state institutions. So there's these 2 dimensions to having inclusive political institutions, okay? So, and, you know, just to emphasize something I said is, you know, there's still a lot of challenges in South Africa because, you know, whatever may have happened in 1994, there's an immense legacy of apartheid institutions in society in many ways. And as I'll say, that's true in every place in sub-Saharan Africa. So sub-Saharan African countries became politically independent in the 1960s, but they still suffered from enormous legacies of the institutional construction of society, and that seems to be something which also should be familiar to people from indigenous societies in North America and Australia. Okay, so let me kind of step back and talk a little bit about the broader African experience, okay, because I think it's representative. I don't really have time to talk enough about it, but I think it's very representative of both the historical challenges and the historical kind of shocks that hit these societies, but also a lot of the challenges that you face today. So, you know, and I would say African economic development, what has shaped African economic development? Well, it's been shaped by its historic economic and political institutions. And that's a discussion we had a little bit today, but we didn't get into very much, which is, to what extent did indigenous society in North America, say, organize itself differently? Did they have the same kind of economy as Western economies, and does that matter, and how does it matter? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the African case. There's enormous variation within Africa, historically, in the nature of economies. Okay, so just to talk about Nigeria, which I'm going to talk about, for example, in the north of Nigeria, in Hausa land, for example, or the Fulani, you had incredible trade. There were Hausa traders who traded in the middle of the 19th century all along the fringe of sub-Saharan Africa. So there was an incredibly vibrant mercantile trade run by Hausa people based in Kano all along the Sahel. Down in the south, in Igbo land, there was also, this was a stateless society. So at least in the north of Nigeria, you had centralized states, emirs, kind of taxes, structure, authority. In the south, in Igbo land, there was no state. It was a sort of stateless society, very politically decentralized, villages, autonomous. There was still an enormous amount of trade. Okay? They created all sorts of substitutes for that. In fact, it's not on the map here, but there's a place here in eastern Igbo land called Aro Chukwu. Aro Chukwu, the Aro became the trading class, and they substituted for the absence of a state by using a local oracle to resolve contracts and disputes. And so they developed, it's a bit like Avner Greif, if you know Avner's work. It's a kind of African Avner Greif. They found substitutes for the sort of thing that states were supposed to do in Europe and which states did in northern Nigeria. I was going to talk a little bit about the Tiv here in southeastern Nigeria because it's a group of people that we know a lot about their historical organization, the historical organization of their political system, and the historical organization of their economy. Like the Igbo, the Tiv were also a stateless society. So they lived in small villages, groups of extended kin, lineages. They didn't have chiefs and authority, at least they didn't until the British came and created them, okay, in the early 20th century. So the Tiv were a society that was stateless, okay, and they lived with an economy which looked extremely different from the type of economy that, you know, as an economist we talk about. You know, we talk about prices and markets and trade, and yeah, there was prices and there were markets and trade, but they were very constrained. So the most famous scholar of Tiv economy, he talked about the constrained economy. There were different things. There were prestige goods and there were other goods, and some goods were traded for money and other goods were in what he called a separate sphere, where it was difficult to trade one with the other. Okay, and I was going to talk a little bit about, this is just the Aro Chukwu markets, I was just going to talk a little bit about the political institutions of the Tiv, because it reminded me of a lot of literature that I have read a little bit about the Pueblo Indians in Southwest, the Hopi people and the Zuni people. I went with my son to the Hopi Mesa, and I was reading some history books, and it reminded me a lot about the historical discussion of why Hopi or Zuni society was organized the way it was. And it was organized in a particular way because people were very anxious about power, and they were anxious about controlling power or disciplining power. Okay, you'll see this is going to be relevant when I talk about Botswana. But I like this story, which I could tell you if it sounds a little bit crazy. Here's the introduction to the way Tiv society was organized. So in 1939, there was a kind of commotion, my mother would have said, a commotion in Tivland in southeast Nigeria. And a cult called Nyambua emerged. Okay, so what was Nyambua? Well, there was a gentleman called Kokwa who sold charms to protect people. You paid him some money and you drank something, and then he gave you a charm to protect you against witches, or a society of witches called the Mbatsav. Okay? Now, this word sav is particularly interesting in the Tiv language because it means power. And it means power over other people, you know, like charisma. When I used to teach at Harvard, I'd always give the example of like Larry Summers, you know, like Larry Summers is a man of sav, they'd say in Tiv country, you know, like he's a very powerful kind of self-confident, charismatic guy. He can get other people to do what he wants. He's a man of sav. Now, the thing about sav is that some people are just naturally charismatic, but sav can also be accumulated by cannibalism. Okay? So a diet of human flesh makes sav and the course of power grow large. Therefore, most powerful men, no matter how much they're respected or liked, are never fully trusted. They're man of sav, and who knows? Okay? So in the Tiv language, this word Mbatsav has two meanings. Powerful people, okay? Plural of sav. Or a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes. Now, when you get into this study of Tiv society, you see that this is a bit like the word politician in English having a double meaning. You know, politician means a group of people organized to contest for public office, and a group of witches organized for nefarious purposes. So what's the point of this? The point is that this was a sort of set of social norms in Tiv society which was meant to stop anyone becoming too big for their boots. It preserved the kind of egalitarianism of the politics, of the society, of the culture. Now, what this gentleman did, Kokwa, was he actually distributed, here's a contemporary photograph, by Hannon. Here's his fly whisk. So you got a fly whisk, and the fly whisk allowed you to figure out who had real sav and who had fake sav. So who was it that these fly whisks got pointed at? The warrant chiefs. Who were the warrant chiefs? The Tivs didn't have chiefs. The warrant chiefs were the fake chiefs that the British created. The British came along and they said, oh, these Africans need to be ruled. Let's do it like this. You know, today I was hearing about this 1934 act in North America where the US government came along and said, you know, we need to create some political institutions for these Indians. So let's do it like this without taking into account anything about the traditional political organization of the people or whether or not there were leaders or chiefs. So that's what happened to the Tiv. The British came along and said, you look like a good chap, I'm going to make you chief, okay? So, but you immediately got the fly whisk treatment, okay? This is a guy, he's got fake sav, you know, the British recognized him, he's trying to get too big for his boots, we're going to go after him, okay? He's a witch. But this is, you know, this is the clash between the traditional culture, which was designed to stop hierarchy emerging, and this colonial foisting of, you know, political institutions that were completely irrelevant to the context on the Tiv. Okay, so this is just, you know, this is the politics. I won't talk too much about the economics. Why won't I talk about the economics? Because when you describe the economics, it looks like, oh, you know, there's all these barriers, there's constraints, there's spheres of exchange, there's not really money here and prices, and you're going to think like, oh, the Africans, you know, like they're underdeveloped, they didn't have markets and things like that. Sure. But when the opportunities arose, they took advantage and they innovated like crazy, okay? What's the best example of that? Just down the road, okay? Oh, so this is my Zuni example, but I'm going to run out of time. So this is just from Ruth Benedict, who was a famous social anthropologist who worked with the Zuni in the 1920s and 30s for many years. And it's absolutely, it is from a book, Patterns of Culture, which I dragged off my shelf. A man who thirsts for power or knowledge, who wishes to be, as they scornfully phrase it, a leader of the people, receives nothing but censure and will very likely be persecuted for sorcery. Okay? So this, again, is a society, very egalitarian society, without political hierarchy, but maintained by a very similar system of skepticism about authority. Okay? And, you know, and that's related to that is this way that the economy is organized as well, okay? But what I want to say is, at the time of the scramble for Africa in the 1880s, 2/3 of people in sub-Saharan Africa were probably living in stateless societies. Okay? So this is a very big thing in Africa. And if you ask me, how to understand a lot of the distinctiveness of African history, I'd say that, that's where you start. That's how did you control power? How did you control authority? That's the intertwining of economics and politics. But that doesn't mean that you can't innovate or change when the world changes. And that's exactly what happened in Africa. Here's the most famous example. Polly Hill's book, The Migrant Cocoa Farmers of Southern Ghana. Okay, so here's the south of Ghana. This is the cocoa regions inland from the current capital, Accra. Here's the British, this is from the Blue Book, okay? 1891, cocoa exports. Where's cocoa exports? There are no cocoa exports. There's no cocoa exports, 1891. Gross capital formation, cocoa, 0, okay? 20 years later, cocoa, 46% of exports. So within 20 years, cocoa goes from nothing to half of exports. Gross capital formation, totally dominated by cocoa. Who was growing the cocoa? The Ghanaians were, the Africans were, okay? So this was a completely indigenous economic boom. These were people, it's a bit different from Tivland, but they had lots of the same economic institutions, okay? They didn't have land or labor markets, very similar to the Tiv. But this opportunity emerged. They took advantage of it in spectacular ways. If you read Polly Hill's book, you see there was incredible innovation in terms of economic institutions, access to land, land rights, defining property rights, enforcing contracts. What did the British do? Nothing. The British appointed these warrant chiefs, these indirect rule. They tried to reinforce a notion of traditional economic institutions, and the Ghanaians just ignored them, okay? Just like the Tiv with their warrant chiefs, okay? So the British didn't do anything. The British didn't build infrastructure. They didn't use British courts to enforce contracts. The British tried to force them to export stuff on the railway, so they just built their own roads because the British just wanted to tax the heck out of them. So they just built their roads and ignored their own railway. So this is something completely indigenous to these traditional African economy, African institutions. There's incredible innovation, okay? What did the British do? Well, the British, what was I thinking? What did the British do? A figure, paints, says more than 1,000 words, my thesis advisor used to say. Here's cocoa exports in Ghana. What did the British do? The British created the Cocoa Marketing Board in 1948, I think. What was the Cocoa Marketing Board? The Cocoa Marketing Board, every Ghanaian farm was forced to sell their cocoa to the Ghanaian Marketing Board. What was the point of the Ghanaian Marketing Board? Oh, to smooth prices for the poor African cocoa farmers, who were incapable of doing that themselves, ha ha. What actually happened was the Cocoa Marketing Board was taken over by the politicians in Ghana after independence and was used to completely decimate the cocoa industry. This is cocoa exports by taxing the heck out of it. So the Cocoa Marketing Board got the cocoa from the farmers, sold it on the world price. By the 1970s, the farmers were getting about 20% of the world price. So that was about an 80% rate of tax on cocoa. Everyone stopped investing, stopped producing. Let's go do something else. We'll shine shoes and sell cigarettes or something, grow yams. So the marketing board, which was created by the British, ended up completely killing the cocoa industry, okay? And here's a big lesson for the economic history of sub-Saharan Africa, which may or may not be relevant for what we were talking about today, which is go back to the Tiv, okay? The Tiv had very effective ways of controlling authority and leaders and things like that. Okay, they had a lot of mechanisms for accountability. But then the Tiv got stuck into this thing called Nigeria with these politicians in Lagos and then Abuja. They couldn't control those people. They had no mechanisms for controlling those people. So it wasn't just that colonialism left this sort of hideous kind of legacy of political institutions at the local level, but it also created these national political institutions that nobody had any kind of mechanism for controlling. And that's the story here. That's exactly the story here. The cocoa farmers could control local political institutions, but they couldn't control the guys in Accra, and that led to enormous impoverishment of the cocoa farmers. Okay, so here's, there was traditional economic institutions. They don't look like modern market, but there was enormous scope for innovation. I think that's the story everywhere you look in the second half of 19th century in Africa. You see all this innovation. Let me give you my favorite example of innovation. Here's King Khama III of the Ngwato. He was king of the Ngwato, which was a people in what was then Bechuanaland, now Botswana, from 1875 until his death in 1923. What did he do? He launched an incredible, ambitious modernization plan. He started a business, Garrett Smith & Co. Why was it called Garrett Smith & Co? Because when he was called Khama. Well, because they couldn't have a black person run it. The British wouldn't have let a black person run a business. Okay? So here's his businesses. Serowe was the capital of the Ngwato kingdom. Mopipi, he had a store here. Sahara, they had Bobonong, they had a store here. They had another store here. He started opening his stores. Okay? There were 8 stores in Serowe. Here you have branches of the Bechuanaland Trading Association underlined. They had branches in Serowe. Who owned the Bechuanaland Trading Association? White people. Okay? What happened when King Khama got moving? The chief's 2 stores at Serowe are gradually absorbing the trade of the place. The chief's purse is long. It seems, therefore, that it's only a matter of time before the absorption of trade by him is complete. Okay? Here's what the acting resident commissioner says. Khama must be humiliated, Garrett and Smith ruined, and the people dragooned into buying for Mr. Juice. That's the Bechuanaland Trading Association. 1916, the colonial government shut down King Khama's business. Okay? So this went on all over Southern Africa. It went all over South Africa. It went all, this is just absolutely the pattern. So attempts to, in the case of the Ghana Cocoa Foundation, the Ghana cocoa farmers, it took a bit of time to run them out of business. It was much faster getting rid of King Khama. Why is that? Because he was directly competing with white people. The cocoa farmers weren't competing with white people. The white people were on the coast trying to figure out how to tax them. But they didn't really have an incentive to shut them down. Here they were directly competing with white businesses, and so they just got shut. He just got shut down. Okay? So this is a story of, and this is right next to South Africa. This is a story of, the crushing of African innovation and enterprise, because it was competing with okay. So here's some lessons from Africa which may resonate, with North America or Australasia. Here's things that are in common: massive expropriation of African assets, land. Okay. Direct interventions of Europeans to block them. As with King Khama, I could talk about that for hours, but I won't. New colonial political institutions foisted upon them from the Europeans. Warrant chiefs, indirect rule. A lot of those guys are still around in Africa today. Some of them are my friends. Post-colonial institutions that got chucked onto them from outside, that they didn't create themselves, and they didn't know how to control, and where there was no legitimate social contract. Okay? And of course, there's a lot of other stuff too, which you may be familiar with. There's a lot of African countries became independent in the 1960s, but there's been a heck of a lot of meddling in African societies since then. If you want to read something really shocking, you should read the African Progress Report on mining, which came out about 4 years ago, which is about how mining companies, Western mining companies behave in Africa. Okay, if you want to read about neo-colonial meddling. Okay, so that's all terribly depressing, and Africa is poor, and a lot of people are in poverty. But let me just end by saying, here's a success story, and there's more than this, but I just, I had too much material already, and that's Botswana. Okay, now unlike the TIV, here's a photograph by the famous ethnographer of the Swana, Isaac Shapira. This is a Hutla in 1930. Okay, so actually, the Swana managed to figure out how to do something the TIV couldn't manage to figure out, which was how to create centralized authority and control it. Okay? Control it how? The Hutla, you can see this is like very participatory institution. So all the evidence suggests that this was very effective at creating legitimate authority in Bechuanaland, what then became Botswanaland. Okay? What became Botswana? What's interesting about the Hutla is that's a traditional institution, but it's been modernized extremely successfully. So when Botswana became independent in 1966, they made an enormous attempt to kind of build the new political institutions, which they got from the British, okay? But they tried to embed them, sort of sneak in all of this traditional system of authority, okay? So building on, House of Chiefs, customary law, somebody was talking about was a very interesting little discussion about what customary law means. But most Africans never managed to decolonize themselves. Sierra Leone, everywhere you go, there's just thousands of English laws on the book without any kind of real attempt to decolonize the legal system and authority. But at least there is this parallel customary law. In Botswana, they've gone much, much further in terms of trying to rationalize that whole system. Okay, and what I'm emphasizing here is that I talked about King Kama and innovation in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but Botswana's been an incredible success. Okay, so here's Botswana in 1966 when it becomes independent. Okay, it was one of the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There was about 5 miles of tarmac road, 2 secondary schools. Here's what happens to Botswana afterwards. Okay, so here's what a bit of political independence. None of this means anything until you get your sovereignty and independence. And it's been one of the most successful economic development stories in the world in that period. Okay, and what was going on with that? How did they manage to avoid the problems of Ghana and the cocoa industry? Okay, well, a bit of political entrepreneurship was a good thing. Here's King Kama. 1895, we were just talking about these chaps in British Columbia going to England and Paris and Rome. 1895, these 3 Swana chiefs, Sebele, Batwain, and here's Kama the Great. They went. This is in Gaborone. They went off to London to see Queen Victoria to negotiate with the British. Very sophisticated. They understood exactly what was coming, and they tried to figure out how to kind of mitigate the worst aspects of it, okay? So they were particularly interested in avoiding Bechuanaland being taken over by the British South Africa Company and Cecil Rhodes. So they negotiated with, they met with Queen Victoria and Joseph Chamberlain, who was the Secretary of State for the colonies at the time, to negotiate this. So, people often say about Botswana, well, Botswana was lucky because, a modern nation state ended up just with like Swana people in it. It wasn't lucky. It was politics. It was negotiation. It was skill. There was nothing lucky about it. They lost huge amounts of territory of Swana people in South Africa. That first map I showed you of Africa, I pointed out Bofuta Swana. That's a Swana tribe that got stuck in South Africa. You go there today, it's like in abject poverty, completely different from Botswana. Okay, so there's been economic growth, there's been no civil war, there's been no coups, there's no violence. I don't have time to talk about it properly. I kind of gave you a sense here, but this is building on a history of innovation, institutional innovation, political innovation, goes back to the 19th century. Kama the Great was much more interesting than I can possibly explain. But here's the modernization of all of that. This is last time I was in Gaborone. It's a hutler. I showed you that photograph from 1930, all those guys at the hutler. Here's a hutler. Gaborone. Gaborone didn't exist in the colonial period. Bechuanaland was run from South Africa. So the British decided, we need to make this place independent. We should build a capital, okay? Let's start building a capital. You need to build hutlers. That needs to be built into the arc. Here it is. That's what it looks like nowadays. Unfortunately, I was there in a rush. I couldn't see action. But, so this is, they modernized, they built the state on these traditional institutions, and that's why there's so much legitimacy and stability and prosperity. So it's an example of constructing inclusive political institutions and constructing inclusive economic institutions. What I'm trying to emphasize is that, that's a heck of a challenge in Africa because of the history of colonialism, because of the legacies of colonialism, the institutional legacies, political institutions in many dimensions that I've been trying to suggest, and also the economic legacies. The fact that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world and white people own all the assets, and you can't just change that with a flip of a switch and say, we're all democracy now, and Nelson Mandela's president, and that's a terribly complicated process. So last slide, Terry's promise, honestly. So creating prosperity is a fundamentally political task. I pointed out Botswana had all these great things going on for it, but they were persistently crushed until 1966 when the Swana people could get on with it themselves, and look what they did. okay? So, you know, as I showed you at the start, when did black people start catching up to their income of white people in South Africa? After 1994, there's lots of challenges, okay? You have to try to create inclusive political institutions. They've managed to do it in Botswana. They're struggling with it in South Africa. They failed dismally in other places, Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe. Look at Zimbabwe. You know, Zimbabwe, they failed. Why is that? Because there's a political legacy of white settler capitalism for you as well, okay? And I just think, you know, I can only talk about Botswana here. I didn't even do that properly. I can't talk about Mauritius or Japan or Korea or whatever it is. But every country, you know, who's succeeded did it their own way. You know, inclusive institutions have to be specific to the society and the history and the culture and the initial conditions. And I think the Botswana example is so fascinating because of this building on this tradition. You know, that's not a tradition that the Tiv or many other African peoples had, but the Swana created it, you know, and you can create it too, and it's this bottom-up creation of legitimate political order, I think, which makes that experience so interesting, but hard in Africa.
I'm not going to ask a question, but a couple of comments. I read the book. I think it's one of the best books that I've read. I love The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. This is right up there.
Yeah. There's far too little attention to economic institutions in The Hobbit, though.
Well, there are discussions about it. The ring. You know, one of the challenges that we have as indigenous people throughout the world is trying to deal with this whole notion of decolonization and where we ultimately fit in the world. And as I've been telling many, many audiences, one of the fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves is, who do we want to be? And that therein lies ultimately the answer. We want to be inclusive. We want to be able to live like everybody else. We want our own institutions. We want our political institutions. We want to be able to live free, as Chief Joseph said. So we live in Canada. And in June, I was asked to speak to the Minister of Indian Affairs staff, who's been mandated to deal with a lot of issues surrounding where we fit into the Canadian Federation. And so a question was asked of the minister, Minister, which books should I read over the summer? So without any hesitation, she says, well, I've got an incredible book on poetry that you should read. That's my number one book, you know, read it. And then I've got these other couple of books that tell some really nice stories about this and that. And so when I got up to speak, I said, it's incumbent on you as bureaucrats to make sure you deal with this notion of save harmless Her Majesty. Because that's one of the big problems we've got is not only is it colonization, but they always tell us what we should do and how we should think. And I said, there's only one book that you should read over the summer, and that's Why Nations Fail. And the reason I'm suggesting that to you is so that you can learn what we need to do in this country. And the purpose of developing this concept of an alliance is so that we can collectively work together on a philosophical approach to dealing with our issues, which aren't just local in Kamloops. Indeed, they're international. And they're connected because of the Columbian Exchange. And we'll never go back to the way things were. But we can be hopeful about our collective future. And if we don't have the concepts of peace, order, and good government internationally, we'll never be able to succeed as humans. So James, I want to thank you very much for your intelligent work. And the chapter there are two chapters that I absolutely loved. One was on South Africa, and that absolutely reminded me of Indian reserves in Canada and the United States. And the other one I really liked was on Colombia, and the fact that since colonization, the Colombian political and economic institutions have been virtually run by the same guerrillas that colonized that country, many, many generations ago. And so it is with great humility that I'm here and been privileged to listen to you.
Oh, evening everyone. I have a question, and it's about these institutions. So we've seen the Botswana example, which is fascinating, and you've obviously got in your mind institutions and tribes and states that have succeeded and failed. So you must have in your mind throughout. So there's a lot of institutions. There's the Japanese variations of corporations. There's our tribal variation of a corporation. There's a whole bunch of things. Have you gone through a study, or is there a publication that looks at all of these? And I don't even think they have to be indigenous, because there's just different cultures and different nation states that have evolved different institutions. Has anyone ever looked at the variety of institutions? Because I have a suspicion there's a variety of capitalism and a variety of government. But is there an assessment of the variety of institutions and the commonalities they have for success?
I mean, there's parts, I mean, there's lots of borrowing. I mean, the Japanese, one of the first things the Japanese did after the Meiji Restoration was they sent off this mission, to Japan, to the United States and Western Europe, and trying to look, how do they do it? Like how to what should we borrow? What should we not? What's useful? What looks like it could be productive? So I think there's always borrowing, dissemination, and I think like most of the social science literature on that is at much too high a kind of bird's eye view level for you to find it useful, I think. There is this literature, for example, on the so-called varieties of capitalism in political science, which tries to explain, how can the United States and Sweden both be prosperous when they look so different? If you look at labor market institutions, Sweden has like centralized wage bargaining and trade. Everyone is in a trade union. The US has, few residual trade unions. There's totally decentralized. It looks completely different. So does that matter? And that literature, which, so there are bits and pieces like that. I think most of the other generalizations are, they're on this level of inclusive. You're trying to say something about everywhere, so you need a language to talk about everywhere. But so, you could sort of say, well, you want to have inclusive institutions, but how do you actually build inclusive institutions in any particular context? What things would make you more inclusive, and would they be feasible given the politics or the society or I think it's difficult to make generalizations at that level. I think, what you best could do is try to look at the book, and is just try to look at lots of just different examples and try to think like here's a place that looked like it had the same kind of problems that we do, and here's what they did. But I think what I guess my view, which you're going to think is hopelessly like naive or something, is that, and the view of the book is that if you can get the politics sorted out, the economics will sort itself out. Like what I heard today at this meeting was, that indigenous people, in North America and Australasia suffer from this incredible relation of dependency on the national governments. They don't have sovereignty, they don't have autonomy, they don't really have control over their own assets and lives and futures. But I think if you solve that problem, then that would be the basis for people to just take control of their lives and take control of their future, and then you'd figure out what would work. So I guess that's my philosophy. I mean, there's lots of models in the world of how to organize things, how to organize firms, incentives, or whatever. But I guess I would say, to me, the fundamental problem is this political problem, that if you manage to solve that political problem, which is what they did in Botswana in some sense, then the economy would take care of itself. Of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't lots of problems to solve and lots of things to understand and figure out how to motivate people and how to mobilize capital and resources. But my sense is that that stuff is there's people who will help. And, if you look at the history of Botswana, a very good friend of mine, Clark Leith, who was an economist at the University of Western Ontario, he worked for years as an economic advisor for the government. They sucked in talent, advisors. Every Thursday night, Seretse Khama, who was the first president, King Khama III's grandson, he'd have a meeting. All these economists would come around to his house for dinner, and he'd ask them questions about, so this business of the money supply, what the heck is that? or the central bank, or the exchange rate, or whatever. Do you think President Kabila does that in Congo? No. So I think it's that. It's just you'll figure the economics out. I know that's easy for me to tell you guys. That's what you've been spending your last 20 years doing that. But
first, thanks to Jim for coming across from Chicago. I've been inspired, as I said, my fires are burning more for this than almost anything I've ever worked on here at the Hoover Institution. The motto of the Hoover Institution is ideas defining a free society. And the kinds of ideas that define a free society, as most of us who live in the United States think about it, are the same ideas that really are lacking in most of Indian country and indeed in most indigenous societies. It's not that the ideas aren't there amongst people like the ones we've gathered here, but implementing those ideas is of course, the big challenge. To the extent that the Hoover Institution and the work, especially of the alliance that we've created, the Alliance for Renewing Indigenous Economies, you can find that at indigenousecon.org. We hope will help fertilize those ideas, help move them in the direction of creating the kinds of institutions that all free people deserve. Manny mentioned the great chief who really embodies freedom, Chief Joseph, and the thought that he would have had the freedom stifled as it was for him, and that it continues to be stifled in indigenous country today is just unfathomable to me, and something that all of us as Americans and indeed people around the world need to work at helping get rid of. Please join me again in thanking Jim. I have a small token. At Hoover, it's common to give people ties, but I don't know that I've ever seen Jim wear one. So instead, we have a leather folder from Hoover. Thanks for coming, Jim, and thanks for the great work.